over the weekend.
So what would be the impact on New Zealand of these? Let's talk firstly directly and then the wider issue that you've raised. I mean, we do export some high-grade steel, don't we?
And aluminium, correct.
Yeah. So,
I'm aware that both of those products goes to the United States. So to the extent that there is a higher tariff, that both reduces the price effectively paid to the New Zealand exporter, but can also decrease volumes. One of the points of concern is that although the US administration is saying that this is caused by decreasing jobs in their own industries, my understanding is that at least a substantial proportion of those job decreases have been caused by technological changes, reducing the number of people who are employed in those industries in the US rather than just a flood of products from overseas countries. And we know in respect of our products that they're not subsidised or unfairly competing against the US interests.
So the wider fear is that China, the EU react, and then what could the implications of that be for New Zealand?
Well, if you turn into trade wars, of course, the long-term effects are quite destabilising in the world, even outside of trade. But looking at the trade issues alone, if New Zealand doesn't have as ready access to sell our products overseas, then the New Zealand economy suffers because we don't sell as much to the rest of the world in order to pay for the cars and the computers and the telephones and the medicines and the CT scanning machines, etc., that we need to import to have a good quality of living. So it's a worrisome trend, and it's one of the reasons why the Combined and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has become more important over the last year, because there are these protectionist measures starting to pop up in quite a widespread way around the world. And therefore an agreement between the 11 countries in CPTPP becomes relatively more important, because within that agreement we're agreeing not to do those sorts of things.
Yeah. We'll end with a final question on that. But just before, I just want to come back to something you said, which is pretty interesting from my ears. You talked about a destabilising effect outside the world of trade. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you look through the sweep of history, when countries sort of divorce each other in their trading relationships and put up trade barriers, it can also lead to deteriorating international relations beyond trade. And so it can give rise to tensions in the world that are to a certain extent moderated by trading relationships, which make countries more interconnected. So when countries start to retreat into their own corner, sadly, it sometimes ends in more tensions in the world.
Just finally, some of your supporters might find it strange that, having seen Labour MPs on the barricades protesting against the TPP, that you're here as a champion of free trade. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, actually, I went on one of those protests because there were problems in the earlier form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, including the fact that we were going to lose the right to control who owns our own homes. I set out the 5 preconditions that the Labour Party believed were valid. Was asked the question as to, well, if we did, if we met those terms, would we be in favour of the agreement? Said yes, and was booed by the crowd. So the idea that I've been hypocritical on this is incorrect.
Fair enough. Thanks for your time. Do appreciate it. Trade Minister David Parker, 8:25.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this with trade expert Charles Finny, who's in the Wellington studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
So on this, the deterioration of a trade relationship, would you agree with what David Parker was saying, that then has a knock-on to other aspects of international relations?
Well, potentially, yes. Early days on this one, the United States has announced an intention to introduce these tariffs, and some countries have said, well, if you're going to do that, we'll retaliate. But they haven't actually introduced the tariffs, and there's yet to be retaliation.
This sort of retreat, this kind of protectionism, this was exactly what Donald Trump signalled on the campaign trail. So how much of a surprise is it now that he would appear to be putting it into practice?
Well, we shouldn't be surprised, and he has been signalling this, as you say, and he's surrounded himself with a group of people who have spent their careers trying to protect the steel industry, so they're being totally consistent in their long-term positions. What is interesting is that he's ignored a lot of advice from others with broader views. There will be potentially very negative impacts for big hunks of the US economy if this goes ahead. And if we start to see this retaliation, goodness knows where it's going to end.
Well, the New Zealand economy, though, how hard hit would we be initially?
Well, obviously there are some companies that do export these products, and just looking at some of the interviews on Sunday evening TV in the States, which I just glanced at this morning, the Trump team do seem to be saying they're wanting to apply it to all countries. There'll be no country exemptions. So there's a direct impact, but what is probably more concerning is the indirect impact. Obviously, the products from the major traders of steel and aluminium into the United States will be displaced from that market, and they'll go into the global market. That will suppress prices, and then if there is retaliation in other product areas, that could impact us as well.
Is it, though, a greater problem if we're looking further ahead, if this were to ramp up and become a more fully blown trade war? That's really where New Zealand could feel it bite.
That's a problem, but I'm actually more worried about systemic impacts, and the United States seems to be justifying these tariffs not on anti-dumping or countervailing duty lines, or safeguard lines. It's a national security exemption they're using, which is very rarely used in terms of WTO law. This is obviously going to be challenged, and I think it's very dubious justification for these policies. Now, what's happening in the WTO is something we should all be very concerned about, because the United States is refusing to appoint new judges to the appellate body, and that body essentially will become dysfunctional in the middle of next year. Without having a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO, we have a real problem which could impact us long term across a wide range of sectors. So my view is New Zealand is doing exactly the right thing. David Parker just described that. I think what we should be doing is trying to get TPP signed, up and running, get as many countries to join that as possible, finish our free trade agreement with the EU, get the EU and TPP to talk together, and then we've got an ability to influence the WTO debate.
OK, thank you very much for your time this morning. Charles Finny, the trade expert in the Wellington studio at 28 minutes past 8.
Earthquake and cyclone hit Kaikoura businesses say they are finding it hard to find staff, and it's been next to impossible to do this over the summer. A 7.8 magnitude earthquake, of course, hit in 2016. It shattered one north and south of the town.